On the show this week, we have a conversation about African giants, South Africa. What role does it play on the African continent? We speak to South African Home Affairs Minister, Honorable Malusi Gigaba. We get your views on the issues. And as always, we have Africa's top 10. You're watching the Africa Leadership Dialogues. I'm Julie Gichuru. This week on the Africa Leadership Dialogues, we speak to Malusi Gigaba, the Home Affairs Minister for South Africa. We ask, what role does South Africa play in African development? Where are we as a continent, and where should we be?
Malusi Gigaba is the South African Minister for Home Affairs. Prior to this appointment, he was South Africa's Public Enterprises Minister. Gigaba also served as the Deputy Minister for Home Affairs. He is a member of the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress and a patron of the Oasis for Hope Hospice. He is the former president of the Youth League under the African National Congress Youth League.
Let's get straight to his views. Thank you so much for making time to be on the Africa Leadership Dialogues. It's great to have you visiting Nairobi, Kenya. As Home Affairs Minister, my first question to you will really focus on where you feel South Africa sits in the scheme of things. When other African nations look at South Africa, and much of the world as well, we see a giant. We expect so much. And yet the truth is, South Africa is just over 2 decades old as a nation state in the post-apartheid era. So what are your thoughts on the role South Africa has to play and its positioning right now on the African and global scene?
Thank you very much. It really is an honor for me to be part of your program. It's a highly renowned program, and I think it's an honor not only for me but for South Africa as well, because it gives us a chance to interact with fellow Africans outside South Africa. Yes, we are an important and strategic country on the continent. Alongside other important and strategic countries, giants. The South African economy is the most advanced. Yes, it's the second largest after Nigeria, but it's the most advanced in terms of infrastructure, the financial services, and other services. So we are quite cognizant of the fact that we have an important role to play on the African continent. It's important for us to have it ingrained in our minds that we are first and foremost an African country. That South Africa cannot be defined outside the continent in which it was born, in which she is growing up, and in which South Africa will flourish for many millions of years to come. Long after these generations are gone, people will look back and will not say South Africa was anything else other than an African country. So we are quite cognizant of that responsibility, and therefore the role we need to play in Africa. For quite a long time, we, not only in South Africa, but the rest of the continent. Let me say first, the African continent has a junior relationship with the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. We have a periphery metropolis relationship, where as the periphery, our job is to provide cheap labor, to send to the metropolis our skilled talent, and fundamentally we are the extractor and exporter of primary commodities, which primary commodities we export not for our own benefit, but for the benefit of others. So rich as we are as a continent in land and natural resources, including mineral wealth, we have an estranged relationship with our mineral wealth. We confront one another as strangers. We extract our mineral resources. We don't do anything to develop them. We send them to the ports. If you look at the freight logistics infrastructure in Africa, roads, rail, and ports, it was designed in the colonial era, and even post the colonial era, we've continued to design it in such a way that it is actually rail that leads straight from the mines to the ports.
So designed for extraction and export.
And export.
Wow.
And so from the moment we extract these mineral resources from the earth to the moment they come back to us as manufactured goods, we are strangers. We don't know one another. It's about time that South Africa developed that causal relationship with its mineral wealth. And we can only do that by having the political will to trade with one another, to redesign the African commerce and trade story.
Before you go on, I want to go back half a century or so. Kwame Nkrumah, the African dream, talking about the exact same thing. And years on, we're at 12%, up from 8% a few years ago. But what is wrong with us? Is there some? I'm going to just ask the question. What is wrong with us? We know what we must do. Why don't we simply do it?
Let me be controversial.
Please.
And say, one of the problems is, the biggest problem, I think, we are involved in too much bickering amongst ourselves. Petty bickering.
Wow.
We lack the political will to want to trade with one another. And thirdly, there are backhand benefits we gain from sending our wealth to others instead of investing in developing them and trading with one another.
Meager benefits?
Meager benefits, yeah. Absolutely. Because the guys who are going to grease your hands for these mineral resources are people who are not going to give you the rest of the wealth. They are going to take the rest of the wealth for themselves, and for us, they give us peanuts. Now, what we lack is that political will to trade with one another, which means that if there is something produced in Kenya, African countries must want to buy it from Kenya. In that sense, you help to develop a center of excellence in that field in Kenya. You help to develop a global organization in Kenya. If you take South African state-owned companies, they've got 3 roles to play, in my own opinion. 1, to develop South Africa's infrastructure, and in the course of that, to develop local supplier industries. Secondly, to develop centers of excellence, not only in South Africa, but for Africa as a whole. So if Transnet purchases fleet locomotives, it must do so for the purpose of establishing itself as a center of excellence on the African continent in fleet locomotives. It must so design the procurement of those fleet locomotives such that you can develop local supplier sectors for fleet locomotives. And thirdly, they must view themselves as regional players. But for them to achieve that, fellow African countries must look around and say, does it make sense for me to buy the locomotives components from some other country abroad when I can get them in far better condition, cheaper, and transport them cheaper from South Africa to my country? So we need to have that political will to look at each other's comparative advantages and take decisions which are going to advance one another, and in that way improve intra-African trade far beyond what we have achieved.
Stay with the Africa Leadership Dialogues.
This indeed is something that has been thought about, and I know former President Obasanjo, former President Mbeki and Mkapa have been talking about that in relation, actually, I believe it was to a minibus shuttle, which is used in so many of our countries, and seeing how do our different countries come together and each country specialize in producing a certain part. Great idea. Who has the mandate to make it all come together? Because at the end of the day, it's almost like we're sitting back as African states waiting for someone to wave a magic wand. That's my first. And my second is the people. The people. So often we leave our citizens behind in the conversation. So they cannot envisage this great Pan-African dream. They don't see it. And the fear starts. And then the protection of the nation, you know. How do we deal with those two issues? Who leads the agenda? And how do we bring the people with us?
You know, the agenda must be led by our leadership. Leaders,
this is our presidents,
yes,
our heads of state.
Leaders must lead. Okay. We must jump out of the comfort zone of our parochial interests and enter an uncertain terrain of common interests. It's difficult, dangerous, it's uncertain, as I say, but we must enter it. And we must know that in so doing, we're going to ruffle feathers, create enemies, especially from the developed north, and we're going to face stiff opposition from your OEMs, your global original equipment manufacturers. Because if you want to make a Transnet or an Eskom in South Africa, an OEM, and enter that supply chain, you must know that the people who are playing in that sector from all over the world, first of all, you are not going to have it easy. Secondly, these companies have dominated the entire value chain of the supply chain sector for centuries, and you're not going to break in that easily. So you need to look for partners. Look for partners within the BRICS, look for partners on the continent, and be prepared to stay the course amidst all the storms. Now, what you probably need to do is to get your big African economies to get together and take some decisions about how do we pursue this vision and what do we do. I'm reading a book by the ruler of Dubai called My Vision. In that book, he's talking about when he decided to establish Global Financial Center, and he asked a question. He called all the ministers and asked them a question. So, what do you think your role is going to be in achieving my vision? So everybody for a moment now had to jump out of the comfort zone, because we can tend as ministers to pursue a parochial mandate. Now here you are being challenged to get out of the comfort zone of the parochial mandate and look at the common interests of the Dubai Global Financial Center. In so doing, I think if our heads of state did that, they will force us to. I think the AU has been trying to do that. And I'm not being critical. I think we could do more. I'm not being critical of my political principles, but I did say I want to be controversial. I think we could do more. For example, if you take the North-South corridor, what do we need to do to make it a reality? How do we ensure that every country acts in the collective interest, and in every country the relevant departments also act in the collective interest of the continent? And the same will apply with the entire infrastructure. I think what I am saying is the continent is calling for leadership. And the leadership must lead for the common interest, not for country interest, for the common interest. I asked a question recently to one of my colleagues in my delegation, that Kwame Nkrumah's dream of Africa's unity, and there are many other leaders, I mean, he's not the only one who's spoken about it, many others have spoken about it. That dream of African unity, was it not naive? If we believe it was not naive, so what do we do to make it a reality? I think that this generation or the next generation can actually make Africa great again. This is not a continent which has always been the lowest caste in the world.
Let's go to questions of security, which, we're facing huge challenges across Africa. South Africa is one of the countries that actually, I believe, you do not allow for refugees to be camped. They actually, immigrants who do come into South Africa live among the community. How are you dealing with security issues? And what advice would you have for other African countries?
It is an enormous challenge, and I think many countries will deal with this differently based on their own assessment of the concrete condition. For example, if you live on a country island or on an island country where everybody to reach your country needs to be on a boat or an aircraft, nobody can swim over. So you can be able to assess the risk from far and to stop it. It's perhaps easier, your rules may be different. In a country like South Africa, we took a decision long ago that we're not going to establish refugee camps. In part, we thought that our human rights ethos, but also because we were not neighboring countries that were sending a lot of asylum seekers. It would be a different case if you are in Kenya, with some of the states surrounding Kenya, some of them hosting dangerous terrorist groupings. It would be a different case.
We are on the front line.
You are on the front line, yes. For us, there have been moments when the numbers of asylum seekers spiked. Like when you had a number of Zimbabweans coming to South Africa, you had challenges in the Great Lakes, and a lot of Congolese people were moving down to South Africa, people from Rwanda. You had instability in the past in Angola and Mozambique, and people moved to South Africa. So we've at moments hosted, received maybe up to 200,000 asylum seekers per annum. The numbers have been reducing gradually to a point now where last year, for example, we received about 70,000.
So passionate. I hope you feel inspired. Now, finally, I'd ask you to look in the camera and very briefly, directly give your message to many Africans watching who are wondering, what can I do in my little space to be part of building this new, this dignified Africa? Please.
Every African must invest in the education of our children. We must never accept any excuse for why our children should not go to school, because the future belongs to them. And we need to develop their leadership competencies and all-round competencies in order to be able fully to take charge of the future. And if we did that, it will be the greatest inheritance we will leave them. As empowered, educated, and skilled individuals, they will be able to reconnect with Africa's mineral wealth. They will be able to take full charge of our political, economic, and security destiny and make Africa finally totally liberated.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Stay with the Africa Leadership Dialogues.
Hi, my name is Malusi Gigaba. I'm the Minister of Home Affairs in the Republic of South Africa. You are watching Africa Leadership Dialogue.
Very inspirational, Gigaba, clearly very passionate about Africa, but we have paused for a lot of thought. What have we got wrong? And how can we move forward now? Leadership, absolutely key, and each African state needs to step up. Now, let's get your views on the issues.
This week we asked you, is African sovereignty more important than legitimate democracy? Evans Omolo says, The time has come for Africa to stand up together and fight with one voice the attempts by the metropolitan powers to dictate who is a legitimate leader in Africa and who is not.
My name is Eugene Talbot. I'm watching Africa Leadership Dialogue from Nairobi County. My take on this week's topic is that African sovereignty is more important than legitimate democracy. First of all, who is there to legitimize the democracy that we want, as opposed to the sovereignty of African states? We want states that are independent, states that can rely on their own, both financially, politically, and economically. If at all our countries will be independent, that means we shall be working on an informed perspective. We shall implement policies that work and that will help the people around our continent, as opposed to getting policies from the outside world, which we are not sure if they are workable or not.
To join our conversation, go to our G+ page, Africa Leadership Dialogues, on Facebook, Africa Leadership Dialogues, on Twitter, @AfricaLD, and on WhatsApp, send your video comments to +254 715 816 033.
Time now for Africa's Top 10.
On Africa's Top 10 this week, we feature the fastest growing African economies. With challenges of commodity slump, currency devaluations and geosecurity risks, economic growth projections are relatively high in Africa. GDP in many African countries is projected to grow by over 2% in 2016. This is according to the International Monetary Fund. Starting us off at number 10 is Uganda, with the growth projection of 5.32% hinged on public infrastructure projects. Coming in at number 9 is Sierra Leone, with a growth projection of 5.34%. Sierra Leone is poised to benefit from the pickup in mining activities following the end of the Ebola epidemic. Taking the number 8 spot is the Central African Republic, with an estimated growth of 5.7%, and this lies entirely on the improved security situation and the holding of presidential and legislative elections. Slotted in at number 7 is Mozambique. The Southern African country has attracted large investment projects in natural resources, resulting in a growth projection of 6%. Kenya comes in at number 6. The East African country recorded an estimated growth of 6.05%, largely because of low fuel prices, improving business climate and favorable weather. Positioned at number 5 is Rwanda, with a growth projection of 6.3% as a result of the quality of institutions and labor market efficiency. Taking the number 4 spot is Djibouti. The country in the Horn of Africa recorded an estimated growth of 6.5% as the country ramps up spending on infrastructure and port facilities. Anchored in at number 3 is Senegal. With ongoing infrastructure investment efforts and strong consumption, the West African country recorded an estimated growth of 6.6%. Coming in at number 2 is Tanzania, with a growth projection of 6.9%, hinged on increased investments, especially in the oil and gas industry, and from ongoing infrastructural development. At number 1 this week is Ivory Coast. With the growth projection of 8.6%, the West African country is set to benefit from good government policies and structural reforms which have resulted in strong inclusive growth, thus increasing both private and public investments. And that's Africa's Top 10 this week.
As always, we end with an inspirational word of wisdom. And this week, the African proverb goes, "An abundance of food at your neighbor's will not satisfy your hunger." It certainly is the responsibility of the African giant economies to help set the agenda and the pace, but it is the responsibility of every African state and all the leaders on this continent to ensure that Africa is moving towards a dignified and prosperous continent for all its people. We must trade together. We must be able to speak to each other, to set our own agenda. No matter what your neighbor has, if you don't have it, it does not benefit you. Blessings to you and blessings to Africa.